Welcome to Behind the Muscle podcast. Today's guest is an NPC super heavyweight bodybuilder. Today's guest is Nate Spear. Nate, welcome to the podcast.
What's up, buddy? Thanks for having me on. Really digging the content lately, so I appreciate being a part of that.
For sure, Nate. So I'm excited to have you on. I know I've had some of your good friends out there on the East Coast on, so I'm excited to chop it up with you, dude, and just kind of dig into all things bodybuilding. I know you've listened to several of the episodes. You kind of know how this unfolds. So I like to kind of keep the continuity, ask the same two questions to all my guests. So the first question, Nate, that I have for you is, who are a few of your favorite bodybuilders of all time?
It's funny because like you said, I have been listening and I'm like, in my head, I'm like, man, I go back and forth because I'm such a big bodybuilding fan. And there's so many physiques that I just love. It's hard. I mean, obviously my number one has to be Jay Cutler, just because he's one of the guys. When I got started, he was like one of the first bodybuilders I saw. I remember, I think it was a Muscular Development, the quad stomp, when he was on the cover. I was in a grocery store. I must have been, like 10 or something. I'm just like, this is ridiculous. Like there wasn't even Photoshop then, but I was just like, this doesn't even seem humanly possible, especially when you're 10 years old. It's still like, what the heck? So that had an everlasting impression on me for sure. And then obviously, as I continued my bodybuilding career, Jay was, you just saw what he did behind the scenes, just how much he put into work and how much he loves bodybuilding. And luckily for us on the East Coast, we have a really big show, two of them that Jay promotes, Cutler Classic in New England, which I've done both of those shows. And I've also went to spectate. And, every time I see Jay, it's like, he seems like he has all the time in the world, but in the back of the head, he doesn't. And he goes up to everyone and just like introduces himself and like, hey, how you doing? Like, your parents are there. He'll be like, yeah, how's it going? Like, and the way he talks to you is just like, he's a normal guy. So that always had like a impression on me too. And then as far as just like physiques go, I always liked the freaks. So Nasser always had an impression on me too, because I remember I had the Arnold Encyclopedia. There's all those pictures of these like crazy guys. And I just remember seeing Nasser and I was like, holy crap, like this dude's a freak. Like, obviously other amazing physiques, but sometimes you just see something when you're younger and it just sort of sticks with you. And I think Nasser sort of had that impression on me. And then a couple of like newer guys, like it's sort of random, but John Del Rosa had a really impression on me just because he sort of looks like me. I'm a little bit taller. And he has like this really bubbly, round look with crazy shape. I know a lot of people probably wouldn't say his name, but he just has like this crazy, like his frontal bicep is just wacky to me. And I always love that pose on guys that can really hit it really nice. And he's also, we've talked before and we've had a little bit of relationship, and he's always like, Jay, like really nice guy. Just seems like he doesn't think he's more important than you. And sometimes that stuff has makes you feel like a certain way and you tend to connect with someone that way. And then right now, just Sean Clarita, just because what he's done is just crazy, because, no one would have said to that guy when he started bodybuilding, no one did, hey, you're even going to turn pro, right? And for him to believe that, it's the same idea with Nick Walker, but we don't have to touch there. But I'm just saying, like, that belief, and like, because there's people that I think try to create that, but they don't really have that belief, like, because they're like, oh, I have to believe I'm going to be a winner, so I'm going to voice it, you know what I mean? But truly inside, they don't believe that. Sean truly believes it, you know what I mean? And I think Nick truly believes it, and you can see it, like it's oozing off of them, right? So that's so cool. And for Sean to win the Olympia is just like, no one thought that was going to happen, and he earned every, earned it every day. And, you just got to have respect for a guy like that. And I think he just puts his head down, does the work, 365, you know what I mean? And just, you got to respect that.
100%, man. No, that's a great lineup there. Obviously, Jay comes up literally almost every podcast. Nasser's a new one. Della Rosa's a new one. I'm right with you, man, with John. Like, I don't know, what it's going to take to kind of for him to kind of take that next step or whatever. I mean, he's already a top pro, but you're right, man. What an amazing physique, just packed full of muscle, dude. Like, it's It's nutty. So I appreciate you bringing up John.
I do
That's
gotta give one more honorable mention because, like I said, I'm a bodybuilding fan. I could go on and on about this stuff, but Justin Compton, I mean, you gotta like throw his name in there because like it reminds me of John a little bit, just a little bit bigger, taller, and just like that freaky round muscle and like shape is just like stuff that you look at and you're like, man, that's so pleasing, you know? And I
right.
think Compton had that.
Yep, Justin's definitely another good pick. All right, so Nate, at what age did you start lifting weights, and then why did you start lifting at that age?
So I actually started a little later in life. I want to say 26. So the reason I started actually is I actually have a drug addiction problem in the past, and it sort of led me to that path. So, I mean, if you want to touch on the growing up part, maybe we could get there first and it'll lead into that.
Yeah,
Because
yeah. Why don't we do that? Why don't we just go right into your childhood, and then you kind of unpack the unfolding of to where you started lifting weights. That's perfect.
yeah, so I mean, when I grew up, I mean, it was pretty like basic for the most part. Is like I guess you could say basic, but it felt like that in my head when I was growing up. It felt normal because a lot of I think kids had, you know, their parents were divorced or whatever at a young age. It just seemed like common then. So I lived with my mom and I had like two half siblings. And then my dad, I would see him like every other weekend. My dad worked like crazy. He had his own business, and you know, he'd be the type of guy that goes in the morning at like 4:30 and comes back at like 7 or 8, you know, and working weekends. And he just worked like crazy. And, you know, obviously that's something that will carry over in my bodybuilding, and just sort of looking at him as like, man, that's work ethic, you know, and you sort of definitely take that home. But I think growing up, it definitely had like some kind of impact on me when I look back. It's weird because like in the moment, you can't really like look at like what's going on. But I think my dad not really being around that much, like sort of made me crave for attention, you know, so I can look back honestly and say when I was younger, you know, I really was sort of looking for some kind of attention or some kind of, I don't know, something where I was acting out essentially. And my mom, you know, didn't make a lot of money. There was a lot of times where she was working, you know, two jobs. So she'd have a full-time job and then she would go and work at like Target or whatever at night, just to make, you know, extra money because she's taking care of three kids. And the other two kids, you know, their fathers weren't around. So there was no child support coming in. And then myself, you know, my dad would pay child support, but it was still, you know, it's not really enough when you have three kids and you're on your own. And it's not like she had some crazy paying job for a full-time job. So looking back now, it's definitely crazy because that's another person, you know, with a work ethic thing. Because you think about now, the cost of living and everything has changed. So someone be able to do that now, it seems like almost impossible. But yeah, so growing up, I just, you know, it felt normal at the time, but now looking back, it's almost like, oh, maybe not. My mom did the best she could. My dad, I felt like did the best he could. So it's nothing like that. It's just, you know, I just, my mom is obviously working a lot. My dad was working a lot, that type of thing. But you know, in school, I was always like popular and I played sports, nothing like to a crazy degree. I mean, I was really into basketball, but I was like always like sort of like the sixth guy or whatever, you know, like not quite like starting, but you know, just sort of playing and being decent at it. So I was always into sports, and I was definitely like athletic, I would say. Um, but yeah, growing up, I ended up getting like kicked out of a lot of schools, you know, getting in fights a lot. And it was like in the moment, I didn't really realize, you know, that I look back and I'm like, man, I was a pain in the ass, you know, so you respect your parents for going through that. Um, but yeah, so, you know, going through high school or whatever, you know, I ended up staying back a grade. So my grades weren't great. I was getting into trouble. You know, but I always had friends. But I think inside I always felt like it sounds sort of like weird, but there's like something missing, you know, and I always felt like uncomfortable in my own skin. I was definitely like insecure. So what was like, um, so I think, you know, the acting out and stuff like that was a way to fill that void. Uh, but you know, I started getting into drugs in high school and stuff like that. And I think that's sort of where it slowly took off was, um, you know, I felt like I was always uncomfortable in social situations. You know, it was one of those things where I was like, is everyone talking about me? Or, Am I good enough? Like those sort of voices in your head. I guess some people would call that anxiety or whatever. I didn't really think about it back then. It was just sort of like, I just felt uncomfortable. And then, so when I started, doing drugs, it sort of took me away from that and made me feel comfortable. And I think some people can relate to a certain extent, but it doesn't get to to the degree I took it to. Meaning like, when someone gets, has a couple beers, they're like, oh man, I feel like loose, I'm not scared to talk to girls. It's the same idea, but obviously mine, I think, was a different degree. So, going in high school, I stopped playing sports. I started like hanging out with the kids that were, smoking marijuana and, getting into recreational drugs by the time I was like a senior in high school. Um, but somehow I did end up, it's weird because I stopped acting out when I started, doing some of these drugs, which just sounds weird, but it almost calmed me down a little bit. So I wasn't so wild. I was just like, oh yeah, whatever. Like more, I guess you'd say like a stoner. So it definitely like calmed me down a little bit and got me out of trouble as far as that goes. But obviously it was not really healthy. But I did end up pulling my crap together in school, and I ended up getting better grades because I guess I was capable all along, but it was really just putting the work in. I didn't want to put the work in. So, junior year started rolling around and I'm like, man, I really want to go to school because I went to a pretty decent like school up in New Hampshire. Everyone was going to college, that type of school. I was like, man, I really got to get my crap together and I want to go to college. So I better, starting to get my grades better. So I did actually start getting my grades better. And then I did get accepted into a college in Vermont. Nothing crazy, but it was like, it felt good because I didn't want to be that guy that was like the only one like left in town type thing. So, and that's when I sort of got to college and that's when it sort of really took off. If I could give anyone advice, looking back, it's sort of like take your time, trying to go into school, maybe work for a year. I think, it's the pressure from society to like rush into a college. But I think when you're like, 18, 17, 19, it's really hard to sort of, what do I want to do? Am I capable of putting that focus in, to perform well? And actually, because I feel like a lot of people, you take a couple of years off, you're probably more mentally ready to, if something changes, when you grow, when you get a little bit older and you're like, okay, like if I went back to school now, I would know I'm not, I don't want to waste my money. Like I'm looking at stuff like that. Whereas when you're young, you're not really thinking about, oh man, I'm gonna have to pay this money, down the road. And you don't really have objective thinking like that at that age. But yeah, so I ended up going to school and it was just sort of like, as soon as I got there, I was like, man, this is great. It's like a huge party, so obviously my mind was not really focused on, going to school and performing like I was talking about. It was more like, oh, let's hang out with these people and, get into trouble and let's party and do this, that, and the third. And, you know, it sort of started out, some recreational drugs and stuff like that. And, then I started to dabble in, cocaine and it sort of just slowly escalated. And then I started sort of, it just sort of all, it's weird. You look back on stuff and it just sort of happens and you're like, man, how did that happen? So I ended up started selling, drugs on the side and it didn't seem like a big deal. It was like, man, I'm a college kid. I don't have a job and I'm making great money. This is awesome. In the moment, you don't really think about all this stuff that's like, oh, this is the, repercussions if I, get caught doing this. This is totally wrong. Because in the moment, I really didn't think about any of that. You're young and you think you're invincible. I'm like, this won't happen to me. So, slowly I just, it's weird because it's so hard to look back on because it's like, it just seems like a mush of like, it seems like a second life, first of all. And then it also seems like crazy, like from a different perspective, I guess. Because I've been so far away from it now, luckily. But the biggest thing that really took a turn was, and I'm sure a lot of people might relate to this, is I was partying, everything was sort of under control, I'm making money, it's all great, partying, having fun. And then next thing you know, this kid's like that I'm friends with, he's like, oh yeah, like you ever try this Oxycontin? And that was like the biggest turning point because in that moment I didn't realize what I was doing. And like back then, this was before like the big epidemic and all that stuff. And what happened was I just was thinking, this is all what the pills my grandpa takes when he has a back pain, or, I didn't, at that point in time, it wasn't really like a big deal, because you're like, oh, this is a prescription drug, like no big deal, right? So I took that and I literally didn't stop for like, I think like 3 weeks straight. And I had like no education of anything. And I didn't realize like, oh, I stopped taking this and I will get sick. Like my body is like forming a attachment to this and all my receptors, this, that, and the third. Um, so it's crazy. I stopped taking it one day and I'm like, oh my God, I feel like the worst I've ever felt in my life. I feel like I want to die. Like, and then one of my friends like, oh yeah, you're going through withdrawals. I'm like, oh great. I wish someone would have told me that when I, took this pill. So it's crazy. Like it all happened so fast. And this is all within a span of like a year, right? So I get to college, dabbling and stuff, and then all of a sudden I'm doing Oxycontin, and then next thing you know, I can't. It progresses to I can't find Oxycontin, and someone's like, "Well, yeah, take this heroin. It'll make you feel great." It's the same thing, really. And it's funny because before you get to that moment, for me, it was like, I'll never try that. I'll never do this, and then it's slowly you're checking the stuff off the box, right? So then next thing you know, like I'm sniffing heroin, and not to get like crazy deep, but I think it's good for people to hear this kind of stuff, because there's a lot of bodybuilders that I have, I've talked about this in the past, and they reach out to me, and like so I think there is a lot of people that do get into bodybuilding because of this stuff. And so next thing you know, it's all sort of escalating very quickly, and like in the moment I'm like, everything's fine, I got this under control, you know which is crazy looking back on it, or like someone else like me voicing that, and they're like, you're nuts, bro. um so then yeah, next thing you know, it's like checking another thing off the box. I'm dating this girl that's probably not great for me, and next thing you know, we're doing IV heroin. And it's like, I think a lot of people can relate to this that have been through drug addiction, because it's like I said, it just happens and you're like, whoa, how did I get here? um so like I said, this is all within a span of a year. And then, next thing you know, it's like my life comes crashing down. And I was only 20 years old. And, my door gets kicked in by the DEA or whatever, the local police. And, someone had turned me in or whatever. And I'm all of a sudden like this kid in a jail cell, like freaking out, like, what is going on? Like this, no way. Like, it's crazy. But yeah, they're like, you're looking at like serious time, buddy. Like, and I'm like, oh shit. And luckily, I got out and it was my first offense. And, they're like, like you could probably like do the drug court thing and sort of work your way out of that. But this is the crazy part. Like, and I don't think people realize, because, especially family members or someone that's close to someone they're going through addiction, that didn't bother me. Like it was scary. But then as soon as I'm out of the jail cell, I'm like, man, how can I get high? Which is nuts, but that's the reality of it. So I started, messing up again, even though I knew that, hey, I'm getting a chance here and I might not have to do time or whatever, and I can sort of get this thing taken care of. So 3 months later down the road, they end up, getting me again. And now I am actually looking at serious time. So, to speed it up a little bit, I end up doing 2 years in Vermont, and I go from this, college kid from a small town to all of a sudden I'm doing 2 years prison time. And it's like crazy, like all in the span of like a year or two. So, to sort of speed up the process, I do the 2 years, and, I go back home, my mom sort of takes me in. My mom's awesome. She's probably one of the best role models, and she's been amazing to me. And, I go back home, things are starting to get good again, and, I got a decent job, I got a car, things are looking back on track. And, sure enough, when I somehow, some way end up finding my way to, getting high again. And to speed up the process, it's sort of like this for another 5 or 6 years, and that's sort of one of the things that I think family members and people don't realize. It's easy because like you think a normal person would say, hey, you just did 2 years in prison, man, like that should straighten you out. But it didn't, and somehow there's always this thought in my head like, oh, I can get around this, or oh, I can get high Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and I can manage it. Next thing you know, it's like that never works out. so we're really, so to speed up the process, I'm back and forth. I'm doing like methadone clinic, Suboxone to sort of manage my life, and nothing's really, happening. And then I finally end up homeless. I think this is like maybe 11 or 12 years ago. And like, I just wanted to kill myself, you know? And I think that's sort of the point I had to get to mentally. Like, I couldn't do it. I was finally emotionally broken down. So, the take home point was, prison didn't do it, losing my license, this, that, and the third, all those things, sound like, yeah, that should do it. But I think for me personally, it had to be emotionally and spiritually broken. And at that point where I was like, I give up, I'll do anything to not feel like this, so finally I got into my third rehab. And, that was sort of the time it clicked. And like I said, I was willing to do anything, so I don't promote any kind of recovery program or this, that, and the third, but I did end up, really taking a stab at AA and, getting involved. And honestly, some of the best stuff I did in my life, I'm not active in it now, just because like life is so busy and things happen. But, I ended up going through what they call the 12 steps, which is like the big book or whatever. And they also, it's sort of related to some old religious stuff too. I think like the Buddhism stuff, they get into that. And it's just like a lot of freeing stuff and going through yourself and looking at yourself and like, okay, like how fucked up am I inside? And like, looking at, all your deep, dark secrets and, just sort of surrendering and giving up. And, all that stuff I think really helped me get to the point where I am today. So I'm like forever grateful for that. So essentially I was in rehab. I ended up getting into a longer stay rehab, which I never tried before. So before I would get into rehab and I would always go back to my same town, you know what I mean? And then I sort of not really fix anything. So it's like, okay, I sobered up for 30 days, but I didn't fix anything. Right. So I think this time was different because it's very uncomfortable. When you're 30 days sober, you walk into this room, everyone's like, I'm an alcoholic, and they're like 60 years old. And, but I was listening to people and I went in there and I said, hey, my name's Nate, I'm an alcoholic. And then after the meeting, like introducing myself, and I'm like, before I'd be like, man, these dudes are a bunch of like squares. Like, I'm not gonna like talk to these people. Like they're weird or whatever, but sometimes like those are the best people that, I formed relationships with, and they taught me sort of the ropes. And, it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to like, share what you're feeling. I know it sounds crazy, but so there was like so much growth with that. And the rehab I stayed at was amazing because it was like an extended stay. So like, they helped me get a job. They helped me, get back into real life, get an apartment in a whole new area that I never been in. So all my friends were like, AA related. So that was amazing. But that was where, bodybuilding started to take form. So, they would take us to the local YMCA, and it was like, man, this feels so amazing. Like, because it was like the first time I felt like, sounds stupid, but just getting an arm pump, like when I'm like, man, 30 days like sober and I'm feeling all these feelings and I'm like this, weird like detox person. I'm like, man, this feels so good. And I think that was like always that thing that I held on to, it wasn't ever like, oh man, I want to get a bodybuilding. I want to, get my pro card. It was just like, man, I started feeling good because I was working out, and that was like it. And, it slowly took off. I was definitely responded pretty quick. I'm going to the gym with all the other guys in the rehab, and, I'm benching like 315, after like, a month of lifting, and these guys are like, what the hell? But I always knew I was a little bit different genetically because to sort of skip backwards, my sister, my half sister on my dad's side was actually an amateur female bodybuilder, and she competed at USA's. And so when I was younger, she would come back home, and she would be dating some bodybuilders, and I'd be like, man, those dudes are huge. So there was always this lasting impression on like muscle and like, big jack dudes. And I'm like, man, I want to be like that someday. So that was always like in the back of my mind. So, and I knew, it was one of those things where I'm like, if she can do that, it sort of sparked, you know what I mean, a little bit of a thought that I could maybe do that one day. But yeah, so, I'm just fresh into lifting and everything's going great. And I finally get out of the rehab and, I'm moving in my own apartment with a couple other sober guys, and, life's great. And, I'm working, and it sounds weird, but just to be working in a normal person in society was like a good feeling. It's like little things like started to feel good. Like when I finally got my license back one day, it was like such a huge feeling. But yeah, so I'm working out, and you know, everyone in the gym is like, oh, damn, like, you know, you look good. And I'm out of the rehab now and I'm at like this other gym that's like a little bit more, you know, bodybuilder friendly. And guys are coming up to me because I got a workout partner too. And he like sort of knew everyone and like, oh man, this kid must be on stuff. You know what I mean? And I'm like, that's weird. I'm like, not even taking like creatine. And, you know, all these dudes think I'm, you know, on stuff. So people are starting to come up to me then at that moment, like, you ever think about doing a bodybuilding show? And I was like, yeah, I mean, I've sort of thought about it. I don't really know how to do that and, you know, prepare for that. And, you know, next thing you know, I'm preparing for my first show all by myself. And I was just doing my own research, you know, watching YouTube videos, going on forums, this, that, and because back then it was like, I think this was 2012. There wasn't a whole lot of coaches or like it wasn't being promoted like it is today. And I was just like, I, I wasn't really like linked up with like the Instagram and all that kind of world yet. And so that's when I sort of, you know, started getting ready for my first bodybuilding show. That's a lot.
Perfect, dude. So that I appreciate you kind of getting into all that stuff. Now, I wanna kind of break down a few things there. So you were pretty detailed and kind of like up to the point when you started lifting weights. So we'll just kind of stay focused on that.
Yeah.
So like when you went from the YMCA to the other kind of more bodybuilding friendly gym, as you said, as you called it, what was kind of like, did your training partner kind of like have like the plan for you, or was it just based off of like the YouTube stuff that you were kind of training? What did that kind of look like? And then once you kind of started doing that first prep in 2012, maybe how did your training change, or how did it stay the same? What did it kind of look like in those beginning days or years?
Yeah. So, I mean, he didn't really know a ton of what he was doing either. So we sort of like, it was one of those things we did like a bro split and it was really just train ourselves into obliteration. So it was like, okay, we got to train as hard as we can, like pretty much destroy ourselves. And, you know, that's sort of it. There wasn't like a whole lot of thought behind it, but we were getting results. So I think that speaks volumes too, though, especially for a lot of younger people, because a lot of my training, my early years was like literally just like destroy myself. And I got a lot of results. I mean, yeah, I have pretty decent genetics, so it depends on the person. But I think what lacks in a lot of newer people, especially from what I see, is, you know, the intensity, the willingness to sort of go to a place that you haven't gone before. So that's sort of how we train. Like we would squat twice a week, you know what I mean, and just like sort of go ham. um, and then as I got ready for my first show, it was a little weird because, you know, life was going really good. And, you know, at my job, they ended up saying, hey, we'll promote you. And essentially it put me in a position to, you know, sort of double my salary. So I couldn't really say no to that because I was already sort of struggling paycheck to paycheck. I wasn't making a lot of money, but essentially that made me move to another place that was like 2 hours away. So that was pretty scary for me, honestly, because I think I just hit a year, maybe 9 months, clean and sober. And, you know, they're like, hey, like move to this new place that you've never been to before. But it was so hard to say no because it would obviously make my life much better as far as financially. So essentially I ended up leaving that gym partner in that gym, and unfortunately I ended up putting me at an Anytime Fitness. So, because it was sort of like in a place that wasn't really like a whole lot going on. But it did teach me a lot because it taught me like how to be by myself. It was definitely scary because I had like this community, you know, this is where I got sober. So in my head, I'm like, man, this could backfire on me and I could like end up relapsing or something. But I sort of, you know, took a leap of faith and, you know, I moved up to this new area. And then that's sort of when I started with my bodybuilding prep. So I was literally by myself, you know, I didn't have a training partner. And then like the AA community up there wasn't really like the same vibe. It was more of like a, you know, country area, different type of sort of people. So that's sort of how I slowly fell out of AA anyways. But so yeah, I started preparing for my first show up there. So I think that definitely helped because it kept me focused, you know what I mean?
For
And like
sure.
I said, I was prepping myself and yeah, sort of getting going there.
So, Nate, you're so kind of like your ham training in the beginning. And I don't want to get too much into anything past the training where you're at today because we're gonna work there, and I still have some things I want to touch on from kind of the past unfoldings that you just shared with us. But just training specifically, how has things changed, through the progression of your bodybuilding experiences through, the years up to kind of where you're at today?
Well, definitely I trained with a lot of volume when I first started and not really having any kind of education on that. So, I mean, it did work, but obviously there comes to a certain point where I learned that, okay, more isn't always better. Luckily I ended up, linking up with a coach that today is one of my best friends, and I only had one coach, and, he's taught me so much. And luckily, that sort of has made my training what it is today. Obviously, as Instagram sort of grows and, that kind of thing, there's a little bit more education. So, I mean, essentially what happened was, I was training with a lot of volume, 6 days a week, two body parts. And then it slowly became, one body part a week, a little more rest, but training intensity still stayed the same, very high. I always am a huge believer in that never changed as far as, going in there and, your focus being, train as intense as you can. But yeah, I mean, that's sort of how it's slowly gotten, and honestly thinking about like contracting the muscle and, rep scheme and, rep tempo and, how can I get the most out of the least? So I guess that sort of changed pretty drastically, because before it was just like, I got to do as much as I can. You know what I mean? When I first started out.
For sure. For sure. Awesome. Now, taking kind of a step back, first of all, the first question I have for you is, since you, got out of your third and final rehab, has there ever been, a relapse for you or not since then?
No. So I've been, I believe 10 years clean and sober now. So yeah, it's just sort of, I mean, obviously one of the scariest things that I faced was when I got into bodybuilding. I mean, we can touch on that a little bit, but it was sort of that leap of faith. Like, so the first few years I competed naturally, and in my head, as, oh man, is this going to put me at risk for relapse to sort of, go to the dark side? Because at some point I became, in my head, it took me a while to sort of cross that line, but it was always in my head, like sometime I might sort of, start taking anabolics. And, obviously being my past, I was sort of like, I don't know, is this going to put me at jeopardy as far as, how my living is going? So.
So if you don't mind, touch on that a little bit. We don't have to get into, the anabolics or anything like that, anything like that in terms of in depth, but just that mindset. Because I think that is something that ties in perfectly with your past and, is going to really connect with some of the listeners. Like, what was that mental struggle for you? Like, here you are, like, an addict, a drug addict, 3 rehabs, prison, like the whole 9 yards, about as bad as it's going to get. Right. And then you have to come to that point where it's like, to progress in, bodybuilding and the type of bodybuilding that you want to pursue. Like there's drug use, there's enhancement. Right. So what was your mindset like, if you don't mind sharing that in depth? And then how did you kind of, with your past, kind of just like move forward and say, you know what, I'm going to be fine, I'm going to be okay. And how have you been able to continue that, kind of speaking to the listeners that maybe are at that point or struggling with that themselves?
Well, I think one of the crucial things was, by the time I made that decision, I had a sufficient amount of, clean and sober time. So I think it had been like 2 years. I didn't know at the time, like how comfortable I was, because it was like the thought was more serious than actually the action, now that I look back on it. But in the moment, it was scary. And I did take a long time to sort of, I did a lot of research. It took me probably about a year from like, when I started thinking about it to actually start to make that leap of faith, sort of say. So I think, taking my time and not necessarily rushing it. And obviously then I end up getting a coach. So that sort of made a difference. It put me a little more at ease, because, I believed in my coach that he would keep me healthy and sort of have the best interest for me. So that's obviously a big role there. But I think, it was really just in my sobriety, I was really getting to a comfortable place where there's no, I guess, people in sobriety would never say there's a comfortable place, because you can always like slip, right? But I think I got to a place where I was comfortable with being in my own skin, right? So like I touched on earlier, it was that feeling of like uncomfortableness, like it's almost like you're itching in your own skin, you know. I guess I don't know if that's like, you know, anxiety or just like, you know, insecurities or, you know, this, that, and the third, but you know, I would use drugs to escape that. So I finally think I got to a place where, because the first year of sobriety is really, you know, difficult and rough. There's a lot of emotions. There's a lot of new ways of dealing with things. You know, there's a lot of highs and lows, you know, so it's almost like you're feeling things for the first time because you've been in a coma for the, you know, the last 10 years. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, this is what it feels like to be happy. Boom. You know, oh, this is what it feels like to be sad. And you're like, wow, all the way down here. So, you know, as, you know, sobriety progresses, it's almost like things start leveling out a little bit. And then you're like, okay, the peaks aren't so high and the lows aren't so low. So you're in a little bit more of a safer zone, I believe. At least for me. So I think, you know, that was put me a little bit at ease. I could really, I've always been really good at like assessing myself, maybe after sobriety, but it was one of those things. Like I think as a bodybuilder too, I'm very realistic with myself. I can be honest with myself. So I think that was a place I was starting to get to. Um, so yeah, I mean, I finally, you know, obviously I did 2 natural shows. And I was just getting to a place where I was like, I don't really, it didn't really seem like there was much more to tap into. Um, you know, so I ended up sort of, you know, making that jump. And as I did, I felt like, um, you know, it wasn't as bad as my mind made it out to be. I think a lot of it is because, at least for myself personally, it didn't really change my, um, you know, thinking or, didn't really make me like, uh, you know, high or anything like that. It was just, I think I was more worried about like the needle part, you know what I mean? Because it's sort of like, can be like a trigger, but luckily, it's like sort of a different thing. It sounds sort of weird, but you know, intramuscular versus IV is sort of a little bit different of a feeling. I know some people that wouldn't really know that or like can relate. It might sound a little stupid, but it does a little bit of difference. I don't know.
Got it. Now, something I want to touch on is you've said this a couple of times, like, you know, when you were younger and then getting into the drug use, you know, you were uncomfortable in your own skin. Is it fair to say, Nate, that like bodybuilding has kind of given you that comfortability within your own skin? Kind of mean like, hey, like you kind of know who you are now. There's a clear direction. There's kind of a clear vision for your life. There's purpose. Is that fair to say that bodybuilding specifically has kind of made you comfortable in your own skin?
Oh, definitely, 100%. Like I feel so like it's a nice feeling because I feel very confident now, and it's not. It sounds weird because it's not superficial. Like, oh, I have all this muscle, I'm confident. It's just like, yeah, I do think some people look at you differently, and it does make me feel a little better, which sounds sort of silly, but you know, I don't think some people would openly admit that, but I think some of us feel that. You know, there is a sense of like sort of power, or you know, people like you walk in the gym and they're like, oh, there's the big guy. I'm like, oh, okay, like yeah. Sometimes it makes me feel uncomfortable, but it also makes me feel like some kind of importance. And it also did change my confidence. You know, just from it sounds sort of silly, but you know, just from talking to girls, I noticed that myself, I got a little bit more comfortable in my skin to be like, oh, I'll go talk to that girl. Whereas before I'd be like scared shitless. um, and I don't know, you know, what the reasoning is for that, because it's not necessarily like, oh, it made me better looking. It's just I think it brought me to a place where I'm like, oh, I feel good about myself, I guess.
100%, man. And I appreciate you, man, just kind of keeping it real, because you know what, like, especially within fitness, especially even more so in bodybuilding, like there's a lot of people that try to, like, you know, put on a front, and especially with social media, we see all the highlights. I kind of bring that up all the time on the podcast, but dude, every single one of us has issues. Every single one of us has struggles. Maybe it's not drugs, but dude, we all have some sort of anxiety. We've all been through stuff. And that's really like why I love podcasting. I love, you know, all things behind the muscle, because we see the muscle, right? Like we see people on stage, on social media. We see all kind of the glitz and the glamour, but it goes back to being behind the muscle, pulling the curtain back, pulling the muscle back, so to speak, and saying, all right, like, this is real life. So I appreciate you, Nate, you know, sharing, you know, some of that vulnerability and keeping it real, because you know what, dude, like we all are messed up, and we've all got issues. We've all got a story, and we all have different feelings and stuff. And a lot of times I think, especially as guys, bodybuilders, people in the fitness industry, we try to hide that. We try to keep that down, and that in and of itself is unhealthy. So I love it, man. Now you mentioned your coach. You haven't mentioned their name yet, but I would love for you to talk about your coach. I'd love to have you kind of just talk about how they have helped you, not necessarily just with bodybuilding, but with life, and just talk about that relationship, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I mean, so I work with Andrew Barry, who you just had on the podcast, and yeah, our relationship's awesome. I mean, it's sort of funny because this was like before, like, I guess Instagram was sort of popular or starting to get too popular, but it was sort of like a random how it all happened. You know, my friend who worked out in the same town as me, his brother-in-law happened to be Andrew, and Andrew was like 2 hours away from us. He's like, yeah, you know, my brother-in-law Andrew is getting ready for this bodybuilding show, which was the Cutler Classic I talked about earlier, which a lot of people in New England, you know, really think is like the bigger show or whatever. And I'm like, oh man, that's awesome. And I was always hesitant to like sort of hire a coach, and I guess some of it might be ego or pride, but I'm always like, oh, I want to do this myself. And so I finally got to that point where I'm like, oh, I need to hire a coach because I crossed over the dark side and I want to do things the right way. And I was still skeptical because I always have this like mindset that like there's a lot of bullshitters out there. So I was like, I don't want to hire the wrong coach, right? And that was even before like Instagram. So it's like obviously way more watered down now. But luckily, so we ended up seeing Andrew compete in 2015 at the Cutler Classic, and we went out to dinner, and it was like we just clicked, man. He got off the bodybuilding stage, and we were just sitting at the Cheesecake Factory shooting the shit, and I was slowly like interviewing him. Like I don't know if you knew at the time, but I was just sort of like picking his brain, and because in my mind I'm like, I want to hire this guy, but I want to make sure he passes the so yeah, I mean, we just sort of clicked, and I just sort of ended up messaging him like a few weeks later and like, hey, you taking on any clients, this and that. And, he's like, yeah, I am. And, ever since then, it's just been like an amazing ride because it's been, me and him have like such a good bond that it's been like, all my competitions, I felt like it's like his competition too. And he's taught me like so much just about being like, he's a very smart guy. So he taught me a lot about, just like I said, like I'm starting over from scratch, from like the drug addiction stuff. So he's like, we talked about building my credit, he's giving me advice on that. He's talked about, getting loans, financial advice, so he's always been an ear, someone I could go to, that I could sort of pick his brain. Cause I feel like he's sort of like someone I want to sort of fill those shoes, and sort of, emulate. So it's been a great relationship, and every show we can look back on that we've had, it's always been an amazing memory. And yeah, I mean, it's just he's taught me a lot, and now he's starting to help me out, like I'm starting to coach a little bit, and every time I have a question, I can go to him, and he's been amazing in that way.
Awesome, man. Yeah, and for the listeners, like Nate said, I just had Andrew on the podcast, so make sure you guys go back and listen to Andrew's episode. And I want to, I want to give Andrew a shout out, man, because everybody for the most part that I have on this podcast, like I've never met you guys, in person or anything. It's all just through social media that I connect with you and then have you on the podcast. But man, like my episode with Andrew, like just through this medium of podcasting through Zoom, like I can just tell, because I know John Meadows had a huge influence on him, but like I could just tell and feel like, this dude is real. And it's like when we got done, he's like, hey man, he's like, what's your cell phone number? And then he said something, he's like, well, where are you at? And I said, well, I'm in Iowa. He's like, dude, he's like, I was born in Iowa. He's like, I was born in Des Moines. I was like, well, so was I. He's like, were you born in Mercy Hospital? I was like, dude, I was. So, and we obviously we didn't know that. He said he lived there in Des Moines for about 5 years, then moved out to Vermont. But the point that I'm getting at is I want to give Andrew a shout out. And again, listeners, if you haven't listened to his episode, go back and listen. But definitely like, just a wealth of knowledge and experience. And just, again, through our time on the podcast and then, chopping up a little bit after, just a real dude, man. So, I don't think you probably could have picked a better coach kind of to start things off and to continue with. Now, let's talk about, I want to get in your contest history because we've already been going for over 40 minutes, but I want to get in your contest history. But before we get there, the question I want to ask you, Nate, once you kind of started competing in bodybuilding, getting your feet wet, so to speak, in competition, did you kind of know then pretty quickly, like, hey, this is what I want to do kind of with my life, and this is kind of the direction that I want to take things for the foreseeable future? Was it pretty quick after you kind of got into competing and really training, like in terms of the bodybuilding way? Was it pretty quick, you knowing like, okay, this is what I want to do with my life?
Yeah, I mean, like, I feel like early success definitely like made me caught the bug. I mean, I'm not gonna lie, I had pretty good results pretty early on. So I mean, that definitely made me like, oh man, I could make this something. And not even like necessarily like, oh, I'm gonna be a pro and make money one day, because I was never like in my mindset. I never even thought that. But it was more or less like, well, I'm pretty good, decent at this, and I never thought like I would turn pro. But it was more like I also loved everything about bodybuilding. Anyone that knows me, like knows like my whole life, like is sort of like around bodybuilding. I'm like a huge fan. I'm sort of always like on the updates. And it's just something that I always just, I think most stuff for like hobbies, I always am like 100% in. It's like I used to BMX ride and I would be like, that's all I would think about. That's all I would do. Then I skateboarded for a while too. And it was like, that's all I would think about. That's all I would do. So I was like, always sort of have that mindset of like, I'm doing something. I'm always sort of like, that's all I'm focusing on. And that's sort of how bodybuilding was, as soon as I sort of started it, I just like loved everything about it, the process and, getting better. And honestly too, it was just such a huge thing for me, being like a recovering drug addict, that there's always something to do. There's always like, the next day, there's always something to focus on. There's no like off switch, right? So there's always like that regimented lifestyle, that sort of, creating habit. That was huge for me, I think, because if I did something else, it's like, there's always like a downtime, or there's always like an off switch. I think bodybuilding, there's always like, even if you're taking a little break, you're always thinking about like, how am I going to get better? Right. So I think that always like had my attention. I really loved that part of it.
Awesome, man. Okay, so why don't you just unpack? You already mentioned the natural shows. We'll kind of put that to the side. So once you kind of started competing like in the NPC, why don't you just unpack your competition history? And then I want you to talk about your mindset currently. Like, are you pursuing that pro card? Is becoming a professional bodybuilder? Is that kind of like the all-consuming mindset now? So talk about NPC competitions, maybe some of the highlights, and then your focus moving forward with your bodybuilding career.
Yeah, so me and Andrew got together, and then we had like a nice long off season before we did a show. And then it was honestly like one of the best memories I have of bodybuilding was my first year in the NPC. So me and Andrew sort of got together in off season. I gave him like about a year. Then we got ready for the spring shows, and I really respect Andrew because he's real. So we were sort of like, okay, we're going to start out this small show, the Vermont Show. And then we're going to sort of work our way up. We're not just going to jump right into, oh, we're going to get nationally qualified and go to nationals. So, and it ended up turning into something more. So this was 2016. This was a huge year for me. So I ended up doing a show in Connecticut, and I won the overall. And like, I didn't go into it like thinking like I was going to win. I was like, oh, I look pretty good, but I still had a lot of doubt in myself. And then, so we did the Vermont show, which is sort of like Andrew's show that he sponsors. It's in his backyard, and, we know a lot of people up there, and I win the overall there. So these are like two sort of smaller shows. And then, so this is also my first year in the NPC. So that's the only reason why I'm sort of doing this kind of stuff, is sort of see where I'm at. And then, so we were like, okay, we'll take a stab at the Cutler Classic, which is like a big show, it's like I said, it's the show in Boston, and that's the show that Jay's at. And, I was like, if I place top 5, I'll be happy. That was my mindset. So we went in there, and I ended up winning the overall, and I'm like, damn, this is crazy. So it was definitely like a high I was riding. And then we ended up doing, I think 3 weeks after that was NPC Junior USA's, to sort of like, we're still gauging, where I'm at. So it's like, okay, we're winning. So, you know, some people might look at that like, okay, like you've had enough, kid, but it wasn't really like a arrogance thing. It was just more like we're still seeing where we're gauged, you know what I mean, or where we're at. So, you know, we went to NPC Junior USA's and we ended up winning my class. I lost the overall, but it was like, damn, like that was like another shock to me. You know, it was like a big deal. So we're like, okay, we're gonna wrap it up. That was a great season, and then like I can't remember how it got sort of decided, but we were like, man, maybe we'll give NPC Nationals a try at the end of the year. You know, so it gave us a few months to sort of, you know, like eat up a little bit, rest up, and you know, back off a little bit, and then sort of get ready for that show. And so we end up doing another show, the New England's, before that show, which was another Jay Cutler show in Boston. And I won my class, but lost the overall. But that was like a really exciting show. There was a lot of really good national guys for a local level show. And then uh so we ended up going to NPC Nationals in 2016 and I got my butt kicked. It was a big wake up call. You know, I ended up getting like last call outs out of like 5 calls, and it was like, man, that hurt. You know, that was definitely a big shock to my ego. And that's sort of where you really decide where you're gonna go. You know, is this gonna like sort of defeat me, or am I gonna, you know, get better because of this? So it was one of those things. You know, it was definitely a different level of bodybuilding that I hadn't witnessed yet. Um, but I mean, I was definitely pretty heartbroken for a few days, and then I was like, sort of like, "F this, like, let's get better," you know, like we're gonna come back there, and you know, and it did make me sort of realize, not that I went in there like I thought I was gonna win, but I was like, maybe I could place top 5. It did make me realize that I'm gonna have to work my way up a little bit to like an NPC Nationals or NPC USA's. That I wasn't just gonna walk in there and, you know, win. Um, so you know, that wraps up, and we end up taking a whole year off because I just want to get better, you know. So 2017 we took the year off, and then from there we had to requalify. So I did NPC Atlantic States, which is, you know, Steve and Bev's show, which is really popular in New York. It's probably one of the biggest shows, honestly. So that's a show that I think, you know, Akeem Williams has won, John Del Rosa's won, when they were amateurs, won. You know, like I think Kai did the show one year. So it's a really big show. There's usually like, you know, 10 to 20 guys in a class. So I went there. I ended up winning the super heavyweights. That was the first year I ended up being a super heavyweight, which is pretty cool. I mean, I was still like 230, but I was like shredded. So it was a good 230. I ended up losing the overall, but we ended up going to USA's. That was probably like the one show besides the Nationals 2016 and USA's, where the one show I was like slightly off. Other than that, I've always been pretty 100%. So, you know, NPC USA's, I was a little watery. I was pretty big and full, but you know, I ended up placing 7th. But for me, that was actually a win, you know, because at that point I became realistic, right? So I think some people would have been like 7th, that's a loss. But I went from last place or like, you know, last call outs at NPC Nationals to my next pro qualifier, NPC USA's, where I got 7th, you know, out of I think 20 guys, and I was a super heavyweight. So I moved up weight class. So for me in my head, I was like, okay, this is a win. And the guys that were top 5 were like ridiculous. So like Ron Gordon was in that class, and Henry Jackson, you know, Matt Berzicott, Brent Swanson. So those are some big names, you know, for me at least. And so yeah, and then from there it was just sort of like, okay, I'm on to something. I feel a little more confident, because after NPC Nationals, I was always like, man, am I gonna like progress anymore? You know, these thoughts in my head, am I really that good? And so NPC's USA has definitely made me feel a little more confident. Um, so then the following year, we end up getting ready for North Americans. So I was looking to maybe make first call out, and this was another really highlight in my career, just because it was such a shock. But we ended up getting second place at NPC North Americans, and I was like ecstatic. Like I got off the stage, I remember, and I hugged Andrew, and it was like such a huge moment for us. We were like, man, this feels so good, because you know, is there like, what if, am I gonna be a guy that can place nationally, you know, or am I just like a local guy winning overalls? So I ended up getting second. Actually, I think you're gonna have him on the show, or did already, but Cade Zook. So that was pretty fun. Cade's an awesome guy. And so yeah, it was just a really big win for me, even though I didn't place first. Got second at North Americans, and the class was like 20 super heavyweights or whatever. And they're all guys that were like 6 foot tall. I was like the shortest one. So it's pretty funny. And then we go on to, you know, so we sort of, I can always prep for like a good amount of time. I can do a numerous amount of shows and I'll sort of be fine. Just because I love to do it and I think my body can handle it too. So we end up going to or nationals. So this is 2019. So second at North Americans. Okay, let's keep going. It was a 12-week stretch, which is a little rough, so we ended up eating up a little bit, sort of backing off a little bit, staying in relatively good condition. And honestly, that was probably one of there's a lot of good showings, I guess, for me, but that I liked. But 2019 nationals, I think a lot of people say is probably my best so far. I was just like peeled, and balance was really good. And I ended up getting third there, which is another huge win for me because mentally I was like, okay, was the second place at North Americans a one-off? And I didn't really think, the competition, Cade was really great, but the competition below me, I didn't think was like, anything crazy. So this next show, I knew there was a lot of heavy hitters, like big names, big followings. So, yeah, like Ben Rafaelia, Brent Swanson was there. And then a couple other big guys, but I knew these guys were really good and they weren't like, really tall guys. So to get third there was a really, really big deal. And that was a really exciting show too, because so they end up rejudging our class at finals, which they don't really do often at national level shows. And it was nuts because the crowd was going wild. And like I was in the center and I'm like, oh man, I might get my pro card, where I knew I was in third or fourth before. And then I still ended up staying third, but so it was a little bit of a tease. But Brent's a really good friend of mine and I beat him there. And so that was a big win for me because a guy that's placed top 5, numerous times at national level shows, he's now a pro, but he ended up beating me in 2020. But so that was, a really good indicator for me. Okay. Like I feel like I'm there. So then we go on to 2020, and this is the year of COVID, right? So we're not really sure, who's getting ready for what shows and sort of like a lot of unknowns. And, so I start prepping for NPC North Americans and, guess who's doing that show? None other than Nick Walker. So, in my head the whole time, I'm like, oh shit, but I definitely was like, okay, I'm just going to bring my best and sort of see where the cards fall. And then there was another guy that's really, really good named, they call him Big Bad Bundy. He's got the big dreads, but he's really good too. So I ended up going to that show, and also my friend Chainsaw, he's a really good bodybuilder too. He ended up getting fourth there. So I ended up getting third. I mean, I looked really good. We definitely tried some different stuff where, to try to fill it really hard. Cause I think in the back of our minds, we knew like, we probably weren't going to be Nick, it's just being realistic. Like I said, we were realistic. So we tried some different peaking protocols, which were good to get out of the way. We just wanted to see how it went. So we junk loaded and stuff like that. And then, so, Nick got his pro card. So I'm like, okay, Nick's out of the way. So we end up doing the same thing we did the previous year. So 2020, we go to NPC Nationals again. And this was like probably one of the deepest lineups going into the show. Cause there's like guys like PH Deadlift was doing it. Who else? Like Brent was doing it. The kid Ryan Crawley that tore his, pec or whatever before he tore his pec. So there's a lot of like big names in there. And I think there was 22 guys in that class. So, I mean, I ended up being in a really great package. I think my legs were like a little bit down in size just from like pushing the cardio and sort of pushing, well, not necessarily the cardio, but just like dieting for 12 weeks more. So I ended up flattening out a little bit, but it was still a really good look. I mean, I can't really complain. And I ended up getting third. So there's a couple thirds and a second, so I missed the pro card by a lot of close placings. And that's when Brent ended up beating me. So we're good friends, but it was that definitely stung a little bit because I beat him the previous year. And I thought I might have got second because like the way we were standing in the middle, it was one of those things you're like, and they call your name and you're like, oh shit. So, and then, so what was there was another question that ended with that, right?
Yeah. What's kind of, so just touch on 2021 and then what's your main focus moving forward with bodybuilding? Is it, I'm assuming it's the pro card, but just talk about 2021 competition. And then, just moving forward, where do you want to take this bodybuilding thing?
Yeah. So I think definitely, so we're getting ready for nationals, which is in December, 11 weeks out. So, I mean, my mindset's a little different. I think every prep it is a little bit different. I'm just fairly calm. I feel pretty confident. Just one of those things, I'm just sort of doing the work. I think you know, the more you bodybuild, the more you mature as far as your mindset goes. So I think mindset is huge in bodybuilding. So now feel like I'm a little bit more of a calm, relaxing state. And you sort of your training evolves too. Like I've heard Dusty Hanshaw talk about this. It's, you know, and I can relate to this. It's like when you first started training, it's like, let's say you're going to train legs, you're like listening to death metal on the way to the gym, and you're amped up the whole time. And now Dusty, you know, he talks about he got to this place where, you know, he can talk to someone in between a set, and then he turns it on and he turns it off. You know what I mean? So I'm getting to this place where I can turn off and turn on my excitement, which I think just comes with, you know, doing it over and over again, and realizing that you don't have to be amped up all the time. You know, because I think when I was younger, I was just like so ready to go and like, oh man, like, you know, it's nonstop and, you know, adrenaline. And I think, you know, I'm at a place now where I can just be a little bit more calm and relaxed and know that, you know, when I need to turn it on, I'll turn it on. And, you know, I don't need to be, you know, raring to go 24/7. And that also helps too with like relationships, work, that kind of stuff. Cause, you know, I love bodybuilding so much, but I do realize that, you know, it can't be like, you know, all or nothing, right? So you got to get back to your family. You got to get back to, you know, your significant other. You got to perform at work. You can't just be like, oh man, F all this, I'm just going to worry about bodybuilding. So I think I'm definitely in a place like that now. I'm also 35, so it is a little depressing, but I think, you know, I'm a realistic person. You know, I'm getting to the point where I'm like, okay, how much longer can I do this? You know, I haven't really had a long career, so it's not necessarily like my body's beat up or I have injuries or whatever, but you know, you definitely get to that place where as you get older, you're like, oh shit, you know, how much longer can I do this for? So realistically, I mean, I know I'm still progressing, you know, so that makes me feel happy. So I think, you know, if I can, you know, obviously my goal is to get a pro card, and then like if I could just, you know, do a good amount of shows and just sort of, you know, have fun with it as a pro. You know, it's one of those things too. I've always had that mindset of uh it's hard to explain, but it's like until I get to that level, I don't believe it. So, you know, in my mind, I'm always like, I never thought I'd place second at North Americans until I did. I never thought I'd be able to turn pro until I got that close. You know, I never thought I would win overall at the Cutler. You know what I mean? So it's one of those things. It's like I train to be my best, but until it sort of starts to become fruition, then I believe it. You know, and sometimes that's hard because, like I said, with Nick and Sean, they have that belief in themselves. And not that I don't believe in myself, but I guess I'm a little bit of a skeptic. So it's one of those things. It's like until it happens or at least comes more visible, then I, you know, don't believe it. So that can be a good thing, but it also can be a bad thing, you know.
For sure, for sure. And I think it's a healthy thing to like, kind of like you mentioned earlier, Nate, like you can kind of like be real with yourself and analyze your physique and just, you know, not be delusional. Cause in bodybuilding and outside of bodybuilding, just in life in general, there's a lot of delusional people, you know what I mean? So I think it's healthy, man, just to be able to take a step outside of your life and kind of have that bird's eye view of your own life, your own physique, whatever, and be able to kind of like analyze and just be real with yourself. Right. Cause like, yes, I'm right with you, man. Like Sean Clarita and Nick Walker, the mindset and the focus and all of it. Like, it's so encouraging, man. It's so awesome. But like, you know, I think I'm kind of like you. It's like, I'm a realist, right? At some point, like Sean Clarita and Nick Walker, like that's them. That's maybe not you. That's not me. And it's okay. Right. Like we're different people. We can be encouraged by them. We can learn from them, just like we can be encouraged from other people and gain from other people. But at the end of the day, like for me, like I kind of know who I am, and that's really cool. And that's great too. Right. So let's just, we're going to kind of start wrapping things up here pretty shortly and quickly. Is it kind of surreal for you, Nate? Cause you mentioned it earlier, like talking about your story, talking about the drugs and all that. You're like, it's like a whole different life. Now that you are completely past that, you're in a whole new life. You have this purpose through bodybuilding. When you do think about your past or just kind of think about where you're at currently, is it kind of surreal? Is it kind of like, do you have to kind of pinch yourself sometimes, be like, wow, like that was my life and here I am today? Is it kind of weird sometimes for you or not?
Yeah, it's crazy, especially like when I some people that have relationships now in this, in my current life, that don't really know me from back then, like my girlfriend, for instance, you know what I mean? She's just like, it's so hard for her to believe. And it's like crazy because, you know, there's like little things that I really just randomly think of, like, you know, sometimes, you know, I got a decent car now and it's like, I'm driving that and I'm like, all right, like I got a nice car. Like, and it sounds stupid to like normal people, but like, you know, I remember when I, you know, I had to go through all these hoops and get my license. I had a breathalyzer in my car at one time. You know, I had, my credit was like in the low 500s. Now it's in the high 700s. You know what I mean? Like stuff like that is like cool, man. And, you know, definitely realize it makes you grateful for like some of these small things that I think normal people probably wouldn't like really understand. And I think that also transfers over into bodybuilding too. But, you know, it's just because like, you know, sometimes like, let's say I'm having a hard day in prep and I, you know, I don't want to do my cardio. I'm like, man, if I was in a prison cell right now, I'd love to just even get on a cardio piece just to do something to free my mind, because you're staring at a wall for, you know, however long. And like, you just want to sort of escape that, you know, looking at a wall, I guess, in a room, you know? So I guess little things like that, you know, it makes me grateful for, because, you know, I'm in a position to be a little bit more mentally sound, I think, and just sort of, you know, grateful and like peaceful, you know. Um, and then yeah, I mean, just it's definitely really hard to believe the further I am from it, the more it becomes like, I guess, detached, and I become like, wow, I'm like a totally different person. And it's so cool, like it's so cool, man, when I talk to people that like, you know, maybe knew me from then, or, you know, high school friends, like they're so proud of me, man. And I had like one of my close friends passed away from an overdose, and his mom was like the nurse at the school, and his dad was like the fire chief. And like this kid was like an honor student, a great kid, you know, it can happen to anyone. And like they talk, they're like, I'm so proud of you, man, because like, you know, they wish that was like their son, you know what I mean? And like, so that's why it's so cool. Like sometimes when people are like, oh man, you like waste your time on bodybuilding, or you do this and that, I'm like, dude, my mom is so grateful that I'm doing this, because where the possibilities that I could be somewhere else, you know what I mean? And obviously that's not everyone else's case, because I know sometimes people are like, oh man, like I get criticized for being a bodybuilder. And I'm like, my mom loves that I'm a bodybuilder, because she sees how dedicated I am. She sees like, you know, the life it's provided for me. And this stuff crosses over into everyday life, you know what I mean? At work and stuff like that, you know, like that attitude. And, you know, how can I progress? How can I be better? I need to show up every day and, you know, perform, not just, you know, I'll do good on Saturday and Sunday, but, you know, Monday and Tuesday, I'm just going to like sort of dick off, you know? So, you know, it's sort of like a blessing and a curse, right? So it's taught me, you know, to sort of be a different human and, you know, use these sort of the stuff from the past as tools in current day.
Super cool, man. You're out there on the East Coast. The East Coast is kind of known for possibly being a little bit more hardcore, you know, than other parts of the country. Definitely known for some hardcore old school gyms. I'm sure you've traveled around and trained at some different gyms. I'm sure you've been up to Bev's. What are kind of maybe the top three gyms, whether they're like Bev's, everybody within bodybuilding knows about it or not? What are like the top three gyms, if you can come up with three of them out there on the East Coast that you would recommend anybody coming out there check out if they're a bodybuilding junkie like you and myself?
I love this question, so I'm glad you asked, because I'm definitely like, you know, I'm all about the gyms too. So, and Massachusetts is like, I think, one of the most underrated states that have like some of the coolest gyms. So there's General Fitness, which is like right on the line of Rhode Island. That's actually where Justin Randall usually trains out of mainly. And that place is cool. It's like an old like shoe warehouse. So, you know, back, so New England's really known for like those old warehouses, or, you know, where they used to produce shoes, or they used to produce random stuff, and then they sort of shit the bed, right? So, you know, General Fitness is built in one of those places. So it's really cool, different. And they have like every piece you could think of, but it's also like the setting is like really, you know, dank and sort of old school. And then there's also, a lot of people might know this place actually, Prime Oxford. So this guy, Dave, actually, the gym owner, was, you know, he was on a bunch of podcasts and sort of news when the COVID thing was hitting. And he was sort of like, you know, trying to stay open and fight the good cause, you know. And so his gym is really cool. They have, you know, all Arsenal pieces, you know, like the great hammer strength stuff, like their own leg room. That place is really cool. And then, I mean, Montanari is like probably my favorite, with super gym out of Connecticut. I actually like that a little bit more than Bev's, honestly. It's a little bit more spread out, but they have like, you know, 5 or 6 leg presses. Evan, trains out of there. He has a lot of pieces he brought in, and they're really nice people. And then, you got Kenny Walks posing room there. So that's always a good time. And then I got to give a shout out to, this is my gym I go to, East Coast Muscle. So they're out of like Southern New Hampshire. It's not like, crazy big, but it's definitely, they got pictures of bodybuilders everywhere. I was happy enough to have my picture up there. And, the guy just really loves bodybuilding, and, it's just a great place to train, and, quiet and not like overrun with people, and just good vibes.
Cool. I think General Fitness, I see Jose and Nate Tello on their social media. They train out of there quite often. Is that correct?
Yeah. So me and Jose are pretty good friends too. And Nate and me are friends, and they did a little cool video series where they went around to a lot of gyms and stuff like that. So there's another one I think they like, that's Impact Fitness. It's got all the red pieces. I like it, but it's more of like a newer style. There's like disco lights and all this kind of crazy stuff, which is fun. But I think they definitely agree General Fitness is the place to be. They like that place a lot.
Cool. And I had Nate on my other podcast kind of before I kicked off Behind the Muscle. And I know here, maybe it's already happened, but he's opening up a place there in Boston, right? Kind of more specifically for personal trainers. But have you been able to go there? Is it open yet? Can you update us on that or not?
So I believe he said it's supposed to open in November, and I can't wait, man. Like, so he's only has it for like, I think he just like rents it out to personal trainers or whatever, which is a great idea. Because Boston, honestly, is such a big city, but they don't really have a crazy amount of gyms inside of Boston. So it's definitely awesome. And like, so I'm watching his story updates, and he's getting all these crazy pieces. I can't remember. He got like the Nautilus leg press the other day, and he's got the glutenator thing, whatever. And so I'm like really excited. He's like, yeah, come down there and train. I'm like, well, shoot a video before you get ready for nationals and stuff like that. Cause they actually came up to so this East Coast Muscle had another location that was much smaller when I was getting ready for my last show right before North Americans, and they shot with me, and they did a little video and stuff like that. So that was really nice of them. But yeah, he's got so many pieces. I mean, him and Jose have been like flying all over to like check out these pieces. I think they went to like that Nashville, Tennessee, it's the same idea that Brandon Curry owns, I think, and then Red Con's gym. And so he's like really into it.
Yeah. No, I'm right with you, man. I'm following his stories, and just kind of like anybody like you and myself who love bodybuilding and, love equipment and love gyms. It's like, dude, like Nate's like, cause I know he's been very successful, and I think he's got, a partner or two, with all the financial stuff. Cause we know that gym equipment I own a gym in Iowa, and it's like, even just trying to buy used equipment, it's crazy expensive. But like, I think you and I both probably looking at Nate and other people, his stories, like, oh, we got this piece. Is like, dude, it's like, it's a dream come true. Like, he's like just in that perfect place for a bodybuilder and an equipment, a snob, so it's pretty fun and cool. Now, because you are a bodybuilding junkie, I want to ask you about the Olympia. First of all, we just wrapped up with the Arnold. Why don't you give me your thoughts? Let's just keep it with the open men, just for the sake of time. But give me your thoughts on open men, Arnold Classic. Kind of just wrap that up, and then why don't you give me, if you want to do top 3, top 5, top 6 for Mr. Olympia? Go ahead and give that to me as well. So Arnold wrap up, and then Olympia predictions, and then we'll close it out.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously the biggest thing was, Nick Walker sort of shocking the world again, right? So like the coolest thing was I was on stage with him a year ago, and like I thought he was impressive then, but like if you put a comparison of side on side, he shits all over what he did at North American. So it's just like crazy to see him keep progressing. And you're always like, it's pretty cool because he's making everyone a believer, and he like sort of called this stuff like I was talking about with Sean. He's like, yeah, I remember a year or two ago, he's like, I'm gonna win 10 Olympias. And everyone's like, you're freaking crazy, dude. And now you're like, maybe. It's like, what the hell is happening? It's so cool though, because like, I don't know, you just gotta, whether people like him or not, you gotta respect that dude. Like, he's like, yeah, I'm gonna win the Arnold. Okay, he won the Arnold, so you really can't say shit. Like, and like he deservingly did, and I think the thing about Nick that makes him so special, he's got the size, but not only the size, his conditioning, dryness, detail. A lot of the pros at that level are sort of hit and miss. Like, what if someone's when we're doing predictions, what if everyone's 100%? No one's ever 100%, but Nick seems to be always 100%. You know what I mean? I think that's the biggest thing. I mean, obviously, you know, he's got muscle for days. He's not really incomplete anywhere. And it's funny, I actually made $150 off of Nick winning because not that I'm going to say I called it, but, you know, I was like, I'll put 50 on Nick. And then a couple of people were like, okay. And, you know, the way I looked at it was Nick is so complete. You know, if you I go through Steve, I can find stuff where he's weak. If I go through Ian, I can find stuff where he's weak. You know, Nick, you know, head to toe, he's not really weak anywhere. You know what I mean? He's got complete everywhere, you know, hamstrings, glutes, back, you know, where most guys are sort of missing it. And then, you know, Steve and, you know, Ian, that's a toss up, you know, obviously that's a controversial one. I mean, the way I saw it was like, I thought Steve would have been a shoe-in for second only because at prejudging, they had a 2-man call out. So for me, that tells me like, okay, that must have been a pretty decent gap, no matter what the scorecard says between him and Ian. And for him to make up that much ground, it sort of seemed a little weird to me. But, you know, I think Ian explains it well. You know, you sort of got to be there at the show to sort of appreciate how good he is. And, you know, I think what really made me happy at that show was Justin Rodriguez. Even though at night, I think he spilled a little bit, they might've like overfed, but I think it's cool because, you know, I saw him, he did a Connecticut show for his first show, like 2015, I think. And he just like came out of nowhere and it was like, who the hell is this kid, you know? And I just sort of watched him the whole time. And when he won North Americans overall, he was just so impressive. And, you know, he just has that special muscle to him. He's almost like that, a little bit of Victor Martinez, right? And just crazy muscle bellies. But I think once he's slowly getting it locked in, you know, I think the Arnold really showed what he's capable of. I think he just needs to stick to a coach. Him and AJ seem to have it figured out. So hopefully he stays there. And, you know, it was really like, honestly, I got to say Justin second at prejudging, but unfortunately, I think at night he sort of lost it a little bit. But I think that was a good indicator of what he's capable of, right? And then as far as the Olympia goes, I mean, honestly, like Nick's made me a believer. I'm not going to say he's going to win the Olympia, but I would not be surprised if they called his name. You know what I mean? And, you know, Ramy and Hadi, I think, are definitely really great. And obviously the best part about it is they've been here for 5 or 6 weeks. You know what I mean? They got their shit together. They know the plan. So I think that's going to be really special to see. You know, obviously a call out with Nick, Hadi, and Ramy would be like nuts, I think. And I think this is a really special time in bodybuilding because, you know, it's funny because I was actually at the Revive gym a week out from the Arnold and I saw Nick training with his shirt off. And I was just like, that is just ridiculous. And it reminded me of like because there's a lot of guys from New England up here that talk about when Jay was coming up. And it reminded me of like what they described. They saw Jay walking around the gym like, and this is like what I thought was like when I saw Nick, I'm like, oh, this is what they're talking about. Like, it's crazy because at first I wouldn't think like he's like a Jay, but now he's becoming more and more similarities. So it's pretty cool to watch that unfold. And I think that's a special time for us because it's like when a champion is sort of coming on the rise. It's a really special moment for like us to watch in bodybuilding, you know what I mean? And, you know, as far as a surprise in the top 5, I mean, I could see Hollingshead maybe placing 5th. He just looks really on his game. And, you know, listening to him on Fuad's podcast the other day, he seems really zoned in, really, you know, everything seems to be money, you know what I mean? Clicking, rolling. And I would really be happy for that guy, man. He just lives the lifestyle, man. He's so humble, he's so cool. Nice guy. I mean, he's commented on my stuff a couple of times, which is always like, you're James Hollingshead, why are you commenting on my stuff? You know? So it's always nice to see people like that sort of get rewarded. And, you know, you see him train and he just like trains like a freaking animal, man. And it's nice to see that in current bodybuilding. You see guys like, you know, Ian, Hunter, James, Nick, the way they train, like, because I think there was a period where, you know, people were getting a little bit of criticism, like, all the guys don't train like they used to train. And, you know, that whole 90s debate, whatever. And I think that has gone out the window now because of guys like that. Like, you can't say those guys aren't training fucking hard. You know what I mean? And leaving it all on the floor, you know? So, but yeah, so if I could call top 5, I'll say Ramy, Nick, Hadi. That's a bold one. Oh man, that's hard. Because then like everyone keeps forgetting about Brandon, right? No one's talking about Brandon. And I'm like, man, how disrespectful. You won the Olympia, you got second place last year, but that's such a hard one to call. I mean, I like Brandon's physique a lot. So let's say Brandon 4th, James 5th, and then Bonac 6th. Oh man, sounds crazy, but it's so hard to call, right?
For sure. So I've got my list down. This will be the first time I put it out publicly. I'll do it right now because we've got a lot of similarities. A few people switch around. I'm going to post it on my social media probably tomorrow. So my top 6, and like there's the list of like who I want to win, but then kind of going back to being realistic, right? Saying, okay, like kind of taking some of the variables, listening to dude, like, you know, I'm a bodybuilding junkie. I'm a fan, right? Like I have never competed in the NPC. It's just going off of listening to other people. So there's like who I want to win and then who I really think is going to win. This is the list of my top 6 who I think is really going to win. Like this is kind of like legit. But I think I've got some surprises. So my top 6: Rami, Hottie, Walker, Hollingshead, Curry, and Bonac.
Yeah, like
we're pretty similar, man. And just to wrap things up here, I'll definitely give you the last word. But going back to Hollingshead, James, dude, I just think because he's over in the UK, I think a lot of people do, like the people that think they know what they're talking about and have different podcasts and, you know, shows and, you know, media outlets. I think a lot of people, dude, are sleeping on James. And you want to talk about round, bubbly, Justin Compton, muscle bellies and just a physique. And then he's got that graininess, kind of like Branch Warren did. Like I'm serious, dude. I think he could easily be in the top 6, top 5, top 4. I want to see him and Nick stand next to each other. I think that would be pretty cool. So any thoughts on that?
Well, I think, you know, I always try to judge these things, and it's hard because I feel like Ian's the same way. He tries to, when he does his analysis, he tries to like be very realistic and like sort of give you a reason and a why. And like my reason and a why is like, and I love Ian, he's such a cool dude, but you know, I think he's a little bit fading. I honestly did think he was better at Texas, even though he thinks he was better at the Arnold. And I think he's sort of lacking a detail, you know what I mean? And I think same thing goes with Steve. You know, so I think James, who has like really good detail, hardness, I think that, you know, detail shows through on the stage, right? And I think that's why Dexter was so good. He just had like crazy detail. So I can see that. And I same thing with like, you know, Hunter gets a lot of hype, but I never really seen him like super dry and peeled. He's in great conditioning and he posts like great Instagram pictures, but I think whenever he gets on stage, he sort of has a little bit of a film. So until I sort of see him sort of break through that next level, because I think guys, this year's been crazy because like Ian's gotten so much better, James has gotten so much better, Nick's gotten so much better, and these guys are already like so good. So I think like everyone is sort of like progressing at a pretty cool rate because, you know, you look at some of these guys and you're like, oh yeah, they're peaked, and then next year, oh shit, like they're not done. You know what I mean?
For sure. And I think Rami working with Chad Nichols, I think that's going to continue to be a great combination. And then Hottie, I mean, I personally am not a fan of Rami's physique. I'm not a fan of Hottie at all. But again, just being realistic, knowing what Hottie had to go through the last couple of years to get on the Olympia stage and how well he did, and then he's been here now for a while. It's just like, hey, you know what? You kind of going back to what you said about Nick. It's like, dude, you just got to respect, you know, when you got to respect somebody. So cool, man. Fun conversation. I really appreciate you, Nate. Just again, kind of opening up, sharing your story, dude. That's really what I want from this podcast is you bodybuilders, top level NPC athletes, professionals, the coaches. I just want people to come on and share their story. Keep it real. You did that. So thank you. Is there anything kind of just to wrap up this thorough conversation that you kind of want to leave or share with the listeners, Nate?
I don't really have too much for words after that. I mean, I think a lot of it was said, and you know, if anyone wants to reach out to me and, you know, talk or whatever about like the stuff I talked about, I always, you know, can give you a moment or whatever at a time, because I think, you know, sometimes when people are struggling, you know, sometimes to voice it to someone that has been through the same thing can be a little freeing and a start to something, you know. Cool.
All right, man. Is there any why don't you give out your new Instagram, and then if there's any sponsors or anybody that you kind of want to give a shout out, go ahead and finish us off with that, please.
Yeah, so I got a new Instagram because my other one got hacked, but same with that guy Jay Living Good that you talked with. But yeah, so my new Instagram is at Nasty Nate Spear, and that's all one word. And yeah, give me a follow, help me get my followers back up. But yeah, no sponsors or anything like that, just sort of sponsorless. I'm not really huge on, like, I don't know, it's, if something great came along, obviously I wouldn't turn it down, but it's one of those things I don't really, the whole code and stuff like that. I'm like, not really for it, but
Got it, man. All right, Nate, I appreciate it, man. Listeners, I appreciate you. I appreciate you listening to, watching another episode of Behind the Muscle podcast. Two things I would just ask of you guys. And if you're at this point, you're still listening, please do these two things, because it's just greatly appreciated. The YouTube is growing, the Instagram is growing. I'm continuing to get just awesome guests on here. There's more amazing guests, especially a lot of the guys are heading out to the Olympia. They just wrapped up the Arnold, so they're coming on the podcast post Olympia. So two things. Take Nate's episode. He definitely opened up. He shared some really powerful life experiences from his own life and journey. So take this episode, share it on all your social media platforms. Make sure you tag Nate. Make sure you tag myself so that we know people are listening. People are gaining that value, that you guys are appreciating the content that Behind the Muscle is putting out. And then the second thing, if you haven't done so already, make sure you hit subscribe on YouTube. I release all of these episodes first on YouTube. So if you kind of want to stay up on all of the podcasts, all of the awesome content and awesome guests, make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel. Again, this is where I kind of put everything out first, and then I go to the other podcast platforms after that. So if you want to keep on top of Behind the Muscle, hit the subscribe button on YouTube. Also, something else you guys can do to help everything out, just make sure you like this episode, leave a comment. What I would love to have you guys do on this episode, Nate and I talked about the Arnold, we talked about the Olympia. The Olympia is 6 days out. Why don't you guys leave in the comments your top 6 for the 2021 Olympia? Maybe comment on Nate's top 6 or top 5, comment on my top 5, my top 6, and share yours. That would be cool. And finally, I will leave you all with this. Remember, behind the muscle, there's always a story. We will catch you guys later.